Hi, everybody. Welcome to Vision 360, where we look at cybersecurity from every angle, starting with the foundations and extending through corporate governance and beyond. I'm your host, Matthew Webster, and I focus on solving cybersecurity governance by helping organizations align cybersecurity with business strategy. That means emphasizing governance, resilience, communication, emotional intelligence, and practical risk management. My approach is shaped by decades of experience in the field, including several chief information security officer roles. I've worked with leadership teams through training, workshops, assessments, and direct advisory support, always with the goal of making cybersecurity a strategic business asset, not a technical afterthought. Today, we're going to talk about return on security investment, also known as ROSI, the cybersecurity cousin of ROI for those who are familiar with it, return on investment, and its involvement in the decision-making process. To explore this pressing topic, we're blessed to have John Checco on our podcast today. John brings more than 40 years of experience in everything from IT, leadership, AI at some very prestigious institutions. But there is no way I can properly do justice to the prolific background that John has here today. So could you take a few minutes to introduce yourself?
Jack of all trades, master of none, lifelong learner. And I think that's what everyone needs to be. You have to constantly keep yourself out there like you do, Matthew. I think I applaud you for doing what you do. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess we're going to kind of jump into it a little bit here, but kind of looking at things from a strategic standpoint. Clearly, you've been deeply involved in a lot and advanced on how cybersecurity decisions are made at the business level. And it's some very big institutions that I mentioned before. Can you walk us through how ROI became a foundational part of your business case and what gets missed when it's not included?
Sure, Matthew, as you already know from your own experience, working in an organization vertically can be daunting. And when you work downwards towards operational specialists, you can't use terms like zero trust. You need to explain what that means in both operational effectiveness and work efficiency. But when you work upwards towards business executives, the narrative needs to be a little different. You need to look at ROI. You can use some buzzwords, but you always have to have that idea of what's the return on investment, because that's what the materiality that they're looking at. It might be easy with some technology, but when cyber, it's difficult to show the evidence of things not happening. If we don't identify a ROSI, the return on security investment, from a needs determination of planning stages, we find that we've given executives an easy out from funding that initiative. So having that ROSI in place and having evidence to back it up is really, really important.
And I think that makes perfect sense because that's one of the things that is often missed in cybersecurity, those near misses. And those are hard to quantify. What's one of the approaches that you would take towards that near miss?
So, you talk about the MTT, mean time to detection, mean time to response. I'm not so much a big fan of those. Those are important for operational sides, but defining that cost measurement is really a tricky thing. So you're talking about, when I talk about costs, I talk about, not only the maintenance, the upgrades, the multi-year licensing discounts, but the human side of things, the resources, and what that means, because you want to know what your team is working on. For example, if you have a SOC, right, are they looking at the tier one issues, right, the attacks that are coming in, bandwidth triggers, or are they looking at more deeper issues like what are the third parties or what are the nefarious actors that are trying to attack us? How they spend their time is really a cost. And so those estimations of cost measurement become complex in cybersecurity. Again, we talk about attacks per hour, how many issues were thwarted. We can't really talk about that. Because that becomes fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And but we also have to take into consideration to the business, what is the business impact of them doing nothing? Because that is a decision to do nothing.
No, certainly. But in terms of capturing that, would you put a dollar value on it? So, because you're trying to capture that ROI, you're trying to capture that value. Would you just include, hey, here's the cost it's going to take for something to come in? Do you include like the cyber risk, which you could pull out of, say, cyber insurance, or you could work off of if you have a quantified business impact analysis that's going on. So there's a lot of options there. How would you capture that ROI?
Wow, I think there's three basic pieces to that. One is we talked about this a little bit before about using FAIR or doing risk management. The idea of FAIR is basically it's a risk assessment that takes into account probability and cost and business impact. So you have that part, and then you have the part I mentioned before about the human risk, right, or the human resources that are needed. And I think the third piece is more about, well, what is the business tolerance, the risk tolerance that they need to work at. You have to take all those three things into consideration. How do you apply dollars to that is really tricky because it's easy to take an intangible, apply a dollar amount, and the CFO could basically negotiate with you what that dollar amount is, per incident.
Sure. So it sounds like what you're saying, and if I'm reading between the lines properly, you don't always own everything. Like I love the fact that you're talking to the CFO, because the CISOs, we know what's going on our side of the house. We can calculate the ROI, like, okay, here's the cost is, and we can reach across the aisle, say operations team, here's the change that we're making, here's the impact. Can you give me a quote? But then there's the business side of the house, and that really has to be done by the CFO. Would that be part of the methodology that you use?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll talk a little bit, I guess, about stakeholders, right? When you're dealing with cybersecurity initiatives, right? You have three types of stakeholders. You have the executive stakeholders, which are the CFO, the COO. You have your key stakeholders, which are the folks that basically help you make the decision and the direction you need to go in. And a good example of that is the CIO defines what you need to protect. The CISO defines all the options of how to protect it, and the COO will talk about the best way of funding that or getting that done. Outside of that, then you have supporting stakeholders. Those are the folks who may not have a directional or decision-making aspect of it, but they're there to actually make you succeed. So the CTO may not tell you what solutions you need, but they may tell you the cost of each solution and what some efficiencies that they can get by using features in a product we already have licensed that we never activated, right? So the other area that is really important is with your key stakeholders, move your tier one assessments to the business. I'll talk about an example here. I was working at a market data firm, one of which had no structured security program or scalability in risk management. And our team embarked on a broad effort to just bring security awareness training. But what we found in each of those groups that there was, one or more individuals who understood the importance of information security and data protection. So these employees became our informal go-to contacts when we had to deal with a cyber issue in their specific line of business. There were 6 lines of businesses. We parlayed that into what we call a formal BISO program, Business Information Security Officer program, where we paid for cybersecurity training to those individuals in return for them to become our formal tier one cybersecurity handlers. They actually still reported to the line of business. They had a dotted line to us, but this gave them a sense of ownership, gave the whole line of business a sense of ownership, that it helped decentralize some of that responsibility, took some of that tier one process off our plate, and actually allowed them to be more effective because they had the ability or empowerment to implement controls that made sense for their line of business, just to meet a policy mandate. So we made this into a mantra that I still use today. It's easier to teach a business person security than to teach a security person the nuances of a business.
Sure. And that makes perfect sense. And what I like about the approach that you're doing, there's a little bit of emotional intelligence involved there too, because you aren't going out there, do this, do this, do this. You're having a conversation with them. They're saying, hey, why don't we do X rather than Y or X plus one or X minus one and to accomplish much of the same thing. And that's okay. It becomes a little bit of a headache operationally speaking, but it can be, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's funny when I was hiring at some of the positions I had, I looked for people, people persons, right? People who have
Sure.
a good way of communicating because it's, again, security is pretty static as far as you have information protection, you have monitoring, blah, blah, blah. What you need is someone who can actually communicate that effectively to the lines of businesses in their terms and get them on board, right? It's really an internal sales perspective when you think about it.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And that's one of the things I've found too. In addition to the CISO roles that I've had, I've also been in sales, and that has been very helpful at trying to communicate with others and communicate with CISOs, CFOs, et cetera. And
Yeah.
that's part of what I'm trying to do now is teach people how to communicate in non-technical language. And there's a lot of things you can do with that, but that
Yeah.
kind of adds to the emotional intelligence side of the house when you're looking at this type of risk quantification, looking at the ROI.
Yeah. I was gonna kind of dovetail on that a little bit.
Sure.
We talked a little bit about FAIR before and the other risk models, and they're really good, but I find that they're really geared towards technology. What I like to do is I was trained in decision analysis and decision quality, which was a, a, a practitioner of Dr. Ron Howard and Dr. Carl Spetzler at Stanford University. teach DA and DQ. And the whole idea is that they actually teach it to big companies like oil firms and financial firms on where to spend, and actually companies like Intel chip makers where they decide to spend their next $1 billion that will take 20 years. So how do you make a decision based on that? And we took that same methodology and applied it to cybersecurity or risks and saying, okay, if what's the risk of doing nothing? What's the risk of being able to roll out some feature without security or certain levels of security? And this strategy integrates really different methods that we know of, like risk tolerance, risk sensitivity, decision trees. But then we add things about from decision quality, like clairvoyance, detectors, preference, equivalency, and game theory, to decide mathematically the best set of outcomes. So we don't really come up with one decision, but we come up with a series of decisions or a series of outcomes that we can possibly take. And those are the outcomes or the decisions that you bring to the board and say, or to your CFO and say, hey, listen, here's our A, B, and C, right? You don't ask them, hey, how can we do this? Or can we do this? You say, we can do this in one of three ways. And so don't give them a way to say no. Give them a way to say yes.
I love that. And one of the things too, like a lot of people talk about, and there's definitely some religious viewpoints on this, whether it's
Oh, absolutely.
GRC versus integrated risk management, and the two sides do argue. But what you're talking about there by creating a decision analysis and using decision, you're making it a business case. It's built into it because you're into that integrated risk management. Because you're talking about that, you're talking about it from a business standpoint. You're bringing those dollars and cents in place and you're saying, hey, here's some options. What do you think is best for us? And I assume you're going to bring it into either a committee, not just a CFO, but it could be a whole cybersecurity committee or it could be others. Would
Yeah.
that be
And
inaccurate or how would you add to what I just said?
yeah, and if you think about like we started this conversation on ROSI or return on investment, and this kind of takes that and kind of we don't ignore ROI, but we built ROI into every one of those alternatives. So we stop talking about ROI and we start talking about things we can do and what's the impact of doing them. And so you don't dilute it, but basically you defer from that hard ROI conversation and say, okay, let's move forward. How are we going to move forward, right? Rather than saying, what am I getting for my money?
And what's also I found as well, because a lot of executives like to say, hey, what's our decision going to be? And give them some options. They feel like they've got some input into it. You've already helped with that. And it's helping with that decision making. It's getting to that execution phase where cybersecurity is really very effective.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
Is it possible to give an example where this whole process that you're talking right now has created difference in terms of cybersecurity investment decisions?
Yeah. So, yeah. I'll go to a case study. When I was researching the for my book, The Resilient CISO, I talked about something called the misaligned security business models. And I found a study in 2012. IBM did a study of the San Jose Fire Department. So IBM had various different service um, service offerings, and one of them was an efficiency service. So they looked at the San Jose Fire Department, and they found that the fire service had less than a 10% utilization rate. So they basically thought that, hey, if we only use the fire service 10% of the time, we can reduce the staffing, right, and save the town some money. Um, really went badly, between the unions and the politics. But if you think about this, it doesn't make sense. We're built for resiliency, not for efficiency. Corporate operations is built for efficiency, right? Corporate resiliency is a totally different thing. And in 2017, a journalist by the name of Eric Saylor wrote a rebuttal, tired that fire departments are response models, not production models. And that's where he pointed out this great analogy I love to use. Um, he said that, if we go to a doctor and the doctor says, you're healthy, you've been healthy all year, your white blood cells are of no use to us because they haven't been used, right? We should just get rid of them all. Would you agree with that? Most people wouldn't because you know that your white blood cells are there in case something goes wrong. So, the same goes to emergency services, crisis management, which includes cybersecurity, right? These processes are there for resiliency to monitor, maintain, and then step in when things get too hot, right? So I think if you can make the business side understand your goal of resiliency, which is their goal too, right? Then it becomes an easier conversation.
I love that. And that's been one of the things that I'm seeing with the conversations amongst a lot of cybersecurity practitioners is the conversation towards resilience. And your example that you're using with the fire department, very useful because I can imagine, I don't know what the context is, but maybe you could help me fill in that if you, let's say you reduced the staff in the fire department, when there is an emergency, you may not have the appropriate people that are needed to actually respond to the fire. And
Oh,
so,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, in here in the New York City area, they usually staff four firefighters on a engine or a truck, and then plus you have an officer and then you have a driver. Well, if you say, well, because of all that cost, if we were only going out, one-tenth of the time, let's cut it down by, to one firefighter per truck. Well, that doesn't give you four firefighters 10% of the time. It only gives you one firefighter 100% of the time. So again, how you look at the resource spend is pretty.
Yeah, I can imagine. So let's take this example over to avoidance of breach when you're talking about ROI and how you take a look at that from a resilience standpoint. How do you look at the calculations when it comes to something like that and determining ROI?
So that's a really tricky.
I asked the easy
Really,
ones.
yeah, it's not easy. So what you want to talk about is you want to look at your industry, right? How's your industry being affected? And there's a bunch of like the ISACs are a great place to get resources for that, right? How many of your competitors and your supply chain have been affected by breaches? Look at their statistics and do a comparison between your statistics and theirs, but also look at the monies spent or the resources spent. Again, we talk about human resources as well. And again, if you spend properly, and then part of this goes back to your cyber insurance statement before, right? How much are we self-insuring? Like how much are we paying our cybersecurity teams to make sure nothing happens, nothing big happens? And then if something big happens, that part is covered by cybersecurity insurance. So this is called the breakdown or the split where part of your company is self-insured. So if you look at cybersecurity teams as self-insurance, what would you be paying in premiums for that insurance versus having those resources on board? And those resources could be tier one, which could be outsourced, right? Easy things, and make your internal folks do more advanced things, tier two and tier three investigations. So you're making the most of that time. I'd rather have my SOC analyst tracking down a threat actor in my network than trying to stop denial of service, right?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So an interesting part of this, though, is how do you communicate this to other stakeholders? Let's say you're communicating with the board or you're trying to communicate with others. How do you bring clarity to that, especially when you're dealing with people who don't necessarily understand cybersecurity or those nuances? How would you bring clarity to it?
So it's a great segue. It's easy, again, for a board to refute spending on a product because they've already spent money. And this is where that what I call diminishing ROI comes in. And this actually came about by accident because I was working on a zero trust initiative for a large bank. And we looked at how much it would cost to refactor security. If you think about zero trust, it's a different security paradigm. It works a little bit differently. A couple things came out of that. So I'll talk about the diminishing part. The whole idea of firewalls, when before firewalls came out, when the internet was big and we were connecting machines to machines and companies, great thing, right? We had all that functionality until things started getting hacked and hijacked. So we bought this thing called the firewall, which blocked 90% of what was going on. And firewalls were pretty cheap. I mean, comparatively speaking. So our ROI for spending on a firewall versus what we were saving was huge. As we go fast forward, we have different types of attacks, ransomware, APTs. We have all these niche areas that are being attacked. And so you see a bunch of solutions out there that will help you manage, monitor, and recover from those things. But each one of those solutions is really expensive and they're only covering one particular specialty. So if you think about what you pay per firewall and what it blocks versus what you're paying for a point solution and what it's doing, it's a downward curve. And if you keep going down this route, it eventually becomes zero. And so you're spending more money than you're willing to risk losing. That becomes a negative ROI. So how do we fix that? Well, with zero trust, we had kind of like four different things that we found. One is look for some monetary efficiencies. We found that we had bought a lot of different security solutions and only used one or two features out of 10 features that we were paying for. So I like using this cyber defense matrix to populate all the capabilities of all our licensed security tools and start marking the ones that we're taking advantage of and ones that we're not using. And that way we can go to the board and say, hey, listen, we need this capability, but we have 90% of this capability in something we already licensed. We just need that little 10% more. So you have that monetary efficiencies you're showing. Um, the second thing we found was because Zero Trust works in a different way, uh, we found our policies so prescriptive that we were in violation of our policies by implementing a Zero Trust security. And being a financial firm, auditors didn't like that. So we knew that we had to now revamp our policies to be more object oriented or be more aspirational and allow the line of business to develop controls that would make them compliant to the policy, but allow them to use their own controls. And that would mean, hey, sometimes reusing some of those security tools, sometimes using a different method. And what Zero Trust allowed us to do now is be able to implement those different paradigms and still be policy compliant. Then we found that with Zero Trust anyway, we couldn't do this major Zero Trust conversion. So we started picking pieces of the organization to convert to Zero Trust. And we did two separate experiments. One was with an area that was not Zero Trust capable. It was all mainframes. And what we did was instead of looking at the network as a perimeter, we started putting perimeters around the mainframe itself and treating that perimeter as a Zero Trust capable entity. So we kind of shielded those mainframes from the Zero Trust controls, but they still were compliant with Zero Trust controls. Then we did a second test where we went to a group that had a full stack. They had everything from the end user interfaces on the web all the way back to the databases and logic processing. And what we found in each scenario was that to comply to policies A, B, and C, they had totally different controls. And both sets of controls were Zero Trust capable. And so what we found was that we need to be more flexible in our implementation, right? We can't just say, go to the board and say, we want to get this product in here to deal with this capability across the board. No. So we find that we design for capabilities and we pick and choose different solutions on different lines of business. And again, we talk about this with the fourth part of this was that because we changed the policies to be less prescriptive, we allowed the businesses to take on some of the way they manage those policies or comply with those policies. They allowed them to empower themselves, and they kind of fell into that tier one cybersecurity sport like I did at the other company with the BISO program. Again, we were empowering these business units to make their own security decisions, and we as experts helped them along the way.
Okay. So it's
That was
basically
a
what it
really
sounds.
long answer, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I'm trying to put it all together because it sounds like what you did, if in short, to simplify a lot of that, is you talk with the business units, you empowered them so they were part of the decision-making process to design what you're getting done in order to move forward. In some
Yeah,
cases, that required retooling. It sounded like there was some strategic challenges with your policies and procedures,
yeah.
so you had to
We work
rethink
from
through
that
what your
way,
strategy was.
yes, we work from that way up, right? If we actually were purposeful in doing that first, we would have come across those other 3 points of contention and had to change them anyway. It just happened to be
Sure.
the opposite way when I was doing Zero Trust. But if you're doing regular cybersecurity, yeah, get the business to own it, give them the flexibility, and then start working your way up to policies, to tool mapping, and to some efficiencies there.
And I like what you said right there because I think that's always been my philosophy. It's the business that owns the risk. Now, I know
Yeah.
things have changed out there, like the SEC going after SolarWinds and Tim Brown. It kind of makes it sound like, well, security owns it. But from reading through it and reading through all the articles and reading through the SEC cases and the fact it was kicked out in certain parts of it, that ownership goes to the business.
Yep. Yep.
And that's where it is. And I think that's something where some cybersecurity practitioners sort of miss the boat. It is a business issue. So by handing it off to them, you're creating the right level of risk ownership, especially when you're starting to define what the ROI is in conjunction with the different business units, such as the CFO. It actually is very helpful for organizations.
Yeah, and I would refrain from using the term handing off security to them. I would say
Well,
mentoring
yeah,
security because you are still having a hand in the
yes,
process, right? You're just giving them the flexibility to make decisions themselves on what needs to be done and how they want to spend that money.
Sure. No, thank you. I actually misspoke, and thank you for the
No,
correction.
no, no.
No, it's all good.
All good.
I got like several things in my mind here. But in terms of that, because what's interesting, you've got a lot of different processes. It sounds like you do some A/B testing to kind of figure out what's going on in the organization and figure out what's the best approach depending on a bunch of different factors. Repeatability seems like it might be challenged in terms of things, or would each line that you're focusing on, like let's say A versus B, be able to create that repeatability in the future? So if you need to cover things that are very similar, you've already got that in place in
Yeah.
terms of the
So,
financial quantification.
and that's a great point because once you have a template, right? Once you've worked with one division on that cyber capabilities matrix, right? The security policy review and the ownership of how they're going to manage tier one and when they're going to come to you and when you're going to support them. You could take that model and say, hey, line of business number two, this is what we did with line of business number one. You tell me what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Because some lines of businesses will be like, hey, you're the cybersecurity team. I want you to do all of this, and you're going to get the budget to do it, or you don't have the budget to do it, so I'm going to have to take on some of it myself from a line of business. So you give them, again, it's not going to be, as a firefighter, we always say not every fire is the same.
Yeah.
Here, you've only been to one fire. Same thing here. You've been to one line of business, you've only been to one line of business, so you have to be, again, open-minded. And again, I always like to look at ourselves as mentors, not um, as support teams, not as regulatory teams, and not as mandates.
Yeah. Like I think one of the big roles that any CISO should be playing is educator,
Yes,
educator, mentor,
always.
whatever it is. But to me, it's like you have to have that education hat. You have to have that education mindset to educate others. I think that's very critical. So I love it. So it sounds like you're creating some good teamwork up at the executive level. And I think that's a fantastic foundation for creating good governance. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit here. I know we've been covering a lot of different things, but taking a look at the broader impact and future direction that we might possibly be going. So in large enterprises, the cost data is often fragmented and siloed. You talked about a lot of those different business units. And what does it realistically take to build the kind of visibility needed to track the cybersecurity costs well? Because when you talk about a lot of the smaller organizations that are out there, it is
Yeah,
so tough to even figure out what's going on, especially if you're dealing with a mid-sized organization of a few thousand people. It can be a huge challenge. If you talk about a
yeah.
small company of like 500 people or less, it's relatively easy because you can get to know the people very quickly. But as soon as you start fragmenting business lines, that creates a whole new challenge.
Oh,
And so the staffing, I can imagine going up. And that's, you mentioned the BISO as one option. What are some other options that you would recommend to help people out in these
yeah.
cases?
If you even look at the technology debt that's in a lot of these organizations, there's a lot of organizations that each line of business has the same tool but a different license to that tool, right? And obviously from an operations perspective, you want to try and consolidate those licenses, but it's really tough in a silo. So the way I would like to approach that in is that have the security teams or have the cybersecurity CISO team own the technology, right? And I'll talk a little bit about my hierarchy and my thinking. So, as a CISO, I see there's four pillars. One is governance, risk, and compliance. That's the upward facing pillar, right? You're talking to the executives and building policies. The second is your external threats, right? Your threat hunting and your teams that go outward. The third team is what I call the insider threat team, looking at folks and what they're doing inside. And the fourth team is actually the cybersecurity technology team, right? These first three teams use technology, but they shouldn't have to maintain technology or licensing or configurations, right? So the cybersecurity technology team needs to buy and maintain the technology and the rules for all the other three groups. So if you take that and extrapolate that out, when we're dealing with siloed teams, we try and give them tools that we already have. We have a cybersecurity technology team that can support them and give them a free license to whatever tool without having them to maintain the cost or incur the cost or the training for that tool. So if they're using a FAIR tool or a cyber capabilities matrix tool or a threat modeling tool, give them the tools so that way they don't have to go out and buy it. That being said, it's still a tough sell. I'm not going to kid you.
Always.
Um, One of the other things I like doing is um, normally in large organizations, you will have a security budget and an operational budget. And so what you end up having is a an operational issues list, and a security issues list. And what happens when budgets get cut? They cut the security budget. So one of the things where I've had success um, is going to the line of business and redefining everything in my risk register in operational terms and putting it in an operational risk bucket. So there's no more security risk bucket. Me as a cybersecurity person maintains the risk register, right? So I have my risk register, but into the line of business is only one list, an operational list, operational issues list. And they can decide whether they want to do regulations first, features, or the cybersecurity issues. And then they basically get budgeted based on that.
Let me jump in here right here, just for
Yeah.
the audience. There are a lot of CISOs who don't understand operational risk versus cyber risk versus business, trying to get into all these things. And there's a lot of discussion around that. If you could help for the audience, explain what operational risk is.
So an operational risk is very simple. You have a system out there and it needs bug fixes. You have a system out there and it has load testing issues. It's down half the time and you always have to reboot it or there's a manual process, right? Or there's a regulatory change that you need to make to reprogram a system. Those are all operational risks at the technical level. Again, when you're dealing with cybersecurity, maybe one of the cybersecurity issues would be, the passwords aren't strong enough, right? Well, what's the operational risk on that, right? So the operational risk is, maybe you have to move from a homegrown library to a corporate library for credentialing. And again, it's not so much a security thing, but an operational thing. Um, and again, you put it in their terms, just like when you go to the CFO and
Right.
you have to put it in their terms, you go to the line of business and you have to put this in their terms so they understand it.
I love it because I think that's the better approach. When you talk about risk registers, and you brought them up once or twice in the conversation today, a lot of them are not aligned with the business. Like I'm very big on taking it, lining it to the business, and there's so many different approaches you can take towards that, but
Yep.
lining it to the business so they can understand it because
Yep.
the communication, because we talk about really having effective communication. And
Yep.
I always tell CISOs, and I'm doing this in the course that I'm teaching for CISOs, learn their language, know
Yep.
what they're saying,
Absolutely.
understand their environment. And if you do, it's going to hit home a lot more. And
Yeah.
that's where you have a better chance of keeping your cybersecurity budget because they understand what that means.
Yeah. And the risk register is important to us because when we deal with a risk register for every line of business, we start seeing commonalities, which could be a systemic issue or a systemic
Risk.
uh,
Yeah.
a systemic risk. But not only that, but maybe it's a single enterprise level fix that the business doesn't have to worry about. That's as cybersecurity folks, we keep that risk register. We just don't share it with the each line of business
Right, right. I mean, you do have to break it down so they understand. So I've
in
done that
their
where I've
in
had to
their
have
language.
multiple. Yeah, you have to have multiple risk registers. You have to translate it. That takes a lot of people power to do. A
Yep.
lot of organizations don't have the people power to do it. And I think that's something that I'm working to change. You've all obviously have been there for a long time. So you're not the
Yep.
kind of person I would try to advocate, but because you're there already. But one of the things too is like cybersecurity becomes more embedded in products, operations, growth, strategy, all stuff that you've been talking about. Do you think that ROI models will need to change as a result of that, or are you facing an overabundance of them already? Because that's getting to be a challenge. Just the way you're talking about it, I'm sure you're making a few
Yeah.
CISOs' heads spin.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's many risk modeling tools out there. I mean, Dread, Stride, Pasta, Vast, TOGAF, and FAIR. We talked about FAIR. You should keep yourself aware of how these tools are progressing. And if you're using a good tool that everyone is comfortable with, there's no reason to change. But if you do want to change to something that's more relevant to the times, just remember you have to backtrack at least 6 months of data into the new model to show what's changed. You can't just say, oh, we just changed the model and here's our security posture, right? No, you can say, well, we changed models and here's how our security posture looked with this new model 6 months ago, and here's where we are today. And that's really, again, that becomes that board level discussion or the executive level discussion to show that you are giving them consistent data or consistent information. Then when you're costing model, you have to take advantage of, I say, your senior employees in each line of business in an organization, right? Because you as a security person don't know the nuances of the business, right? It's right, security, business person
Sure.
security. So go to the senior folks in each one of those things and say, I think this is the business impact of this going wrong or this going bad. Tell me more. What do you think? And what do you think the solutions are? Because I learned from my 20 years of consulting before I became a full-time employee was that 90% of times the answer in an organization, in a client, is within the client already. They're just not listening to their own people. So you take what the
Yeah.
people say, you rebrand it, and all of a sudden it becomes gold. Now, after you do all this and you try and looked at that ROSI or ROI, you may not find that there's any difference, and that's okay. But you've done, like with that DADQ strategy, you've done the analysis, you've done the quality checks, you've done the right things because a decision is an outcome based on evidence and data. It's not based on gut. And that's one of the things where we try and get to with that ROSI is that you build your return based on evidence.
Love it. And so that's kind of an interesting part too, because I've been looking at a lot of the risk quantification and I do a lot in risk quantification. And I think part of the challenge that I've been seeing with a lot of CISOs and others, and I know like they'll buy some new product and they think, hey, here's how to do it, and it falls flat. It doesn't go anywhere. And
Yep.
some of that, I think, because like the approach that you're talking about is a lot more mature than the way a lot of the CISOs operate, because it actually is a more emotionally intelligent approach. You're not shoving something in somebody's face and saying, here's the route, and say, buy me something based on $100 million risk or whatever the story is. And I find that those approaches tend not to work. And I've worked with a lot of CISOs who are very frustrated because they walk in and use that approach. In terms of trying to help some of the CISOs communicate and bridge that gap of communication between the business and others, what is your approach and thinking related to risk quantification? I know I've kind of given you a loaded question here versus working with the business to determine what those risks actually are.
And you made a good point. Like a lot of CISOs don't take the time to do this, and it's not their fault because they're understaffed. They are basically in way over their head, or the business doesn't reveal the root causes of some of the things that they're seeing. And so they're always behind the eight ball. And I really, when I was an advisory CISO to many companies, we found the same thing over and over again, that basically they're thrown into the lion's den and they're not given any information, and that becomes an issue. So, you know, I would say, you have to, number one, get as much information as you can, then start focusing on emphasizing resiliency through business continuity. And again, make use of that cyber capabilities matrix. Even if it's not a matrix, define the cyber capabilities that you need and how they're being satisfied. So that's really important because we design for capabilities and we replace technology or solutions to meet those capabilities. The capabilities don't change, right? You may need more capabilities as your feature set changes, right? From a product perspective, but your basic security has a set of capabilities that's not going to change. And financial teams, they always want to talk efficiency. And this is where you have to, again, use that white blood cell theory to show them that listen, we are built for resiliency, not efficiency. If you want to find efficiencies, let's look at the tools we have today and where we can start using them to their fullest. And that's really, once we have that laid out, then we can say, okay, we're using all our tools at 80% capacity. We still have these capabilities that we're not meeting. And this is where you can help me, CFO, manage that gap because that gap is going to cost us $3 million. But if that's your risk tolerance, that's okay. I'm just pointing it out there, right? You're not asking to close to be 100% secure. You're asking to say, is this risk that we're taking acceptable to the board?
Sure. And do you use language in working with the CFOs, things like value at risk?
Yes, absolutely. So we talk about what I call potential and kinetic risk, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
potential risk is really worst case scenario. Kinetic risk is in the fair term, right? The most probable or most probable the most frequent outcome that you may have. And then again you can work your way from there, saying, okay, if I'm, and this goes back to that self-insurance conversation, right? So we have product A, we're covering 50% of our risk, of our kinetic, 100% of our kinetic risk and 50% of our potential risk. But that extra 50% that we're not covering may cost us $3 million. Are we willing to self-insure against that? We're willing to be able to do that. And some things don't have a dollar amount. So customer loyalty, right? return, customer return or rolling revenue, right? These are things that we may not have a number on. And so we have to say, okay, that's an intangible risk. How do you want to handle it? And work from there.
I think that's fantastic. That's a really good approach. So if you had to give CISOs one piece of advice when they're talking about ROI to the board or to other internal stakeholders, what would that advice be?
Yeah, so it's real simple. You got to frame the conversation, meaning that boards are very efficient in themselves. Start with the ask, right? What is the decision? Why am I here? Why am I'm talking to you today? Well, I need something or I need your advice on something. I need to inform you of something. And then go and present the alternatives, right? Never allow an open-ended answer. So I said, from our analysis, we see this is path A, path B, path C. Then be prepared to answer questions and show the ROI for each alternative, right? Um, and when I did the zero trust case to the executives, um, I one of the alternatives was do nothing, status quo. And that's where I came up with that diminishing ROSI calculation, showing that, in 10 years, if we keep doing the same thing, we're just spending more money than we're actually protecting. And that kind of hit home for them.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too, because a lot of CISOs want to be perfect. And that's why I think you see such a massive, massive proliferation of tool. Every single little thing has got to have protection on it.
Yep.
Like with some of the stuff that's being upgraded, if you fingerprint documents, for example, and you don't want that to go into AI, you could get that done through DLP. Some of the fingerprinting DLP, you don't need to have a brand new AI tool to interface
Yep.
with it
Yep.
to be able to make those determinations. So it definitely is a challenge that I think a lot of CISOs and others are working on and recognizing that. Like for myself, I've gotten rid of tons of tools in organizations because they're a waste of time. Is that truly valuable? Are we
Yep.
getting the ROI on that? And I think that's something that good CISOs need to sit down and think about.
And it's okay, we didn't bring up this point yet, but it's actually okay to fail. It's okay to say this was the wrong decision, and we paid for a 1 year license. It's the wrong decision. We're not going to renew, and we're going to go in a different direction. Um, Being able to say what you did right and what you did wrong, and well, not so much wrong, but wasn't the proper thing for the proper time is okay. Um, I think, you know, if you're always going and saying this is working perfectly, I'd be suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that businesses need to understand too, because there's a difference between letting them fail and, hey, let's experiment on this and see if it works. Because the
Iteration,
reality
we
is,
call
when
it.
you're
Yeah.
working with different companies, I've seen them that's like they look great on paper, but then the execution is terrible.
Yeah.
And then you need to back out of that. And you need to make sure that the business people know that. But in highly toxic environments, that can definitely be a challenge for CISOs. I'm sure it sounds like you've been there. You're just like rolling
Yeah.
your eyes, like, yep, I know.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very helpful, especially when you're in firefighting mode as a CISO, or if you
Yeah.
have other people on your team that are doing that.
Yeah.
You're going to expect them to freak out and you've got to calm them down. It's part of your job as being a
Absolutely.
therapist, as a CISO, like relax, relax, relax. You've been there before. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything that you brought to the table today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show and loved everything you had to say. I think it's going to be
Matthew, I
very
appreciate that.
educational for people. So thank you so much. All right. Thanks, everybody.